Bienvenides, welcome, Wepa, to everyone who's joined us. We are kicking off our fourth and last installment of the Good Ancestors series. This conversation today is titled "Don't Wait for Election Day." My name is Inaru Melendez Vasquez, she, her pronouns. I'm the Senior Communications Manager at HIP. I'm very, very, very excited for this conversation today with such powerful women who are leading some great work across the country. I just wanted to jump on to talk about a little bit of housekeeping. A quick reminder that our webinar spaces are in exchange, are for exchange and respectful conversation. While we might disagree on some points, discrimination and intimidation via chat or other methods on our platforms will not be tolerated. And we reserve the right to review all registrants and participants who do not comply with our community agreements. That said, I'm gonna turn off my camera. I just wanted to say hello. I'm usually running the tech side of these things, so it's nice to just show my face really quick. And yeah, thank you for being here. And I'm gonna pass it off to Hilda Vega.
Thank you, Inadu. And I want to appreciate Inadu and the HipComs team for all of the work they have done behind the Good Ancestors series. They are behind the scenes, a little reluctant to be on camera, so I'm glad that Inadu was willing to kick us off today. For folks who don't know me, I'm Hilda Vega. I'm HIP's VP for philanthropic practice and have been working with our comms team and Jazz and other folks to bring the Good Ancestors series to everyone in our network. Appreciate the folks who have joined us for the entire series and everyone who is with us today in our last conversation for this year, but hopefully the beginning of ways that we together can explore how we build the future that we want rather than live in a future that other people have been designing and building for us. I have been thinking a lot about a gathering I went to last week. It was folks from all over the world, Europe, Africa, the Americas, and talking about different ways that philanthropy and the social sector can use the tools of futurism, not the ones that were necessarily designed by business school, but the ones that we already know from our communities. And we invited two women from Mesoamerica to lead us in an introduction exercise that was really powerful. And what stuck with me about that conversation was that we were asked to introduce ourselves, but not, hi, I'm Hilda, but rather using and acknowledging the territories that we come from and then referring to ourselves in the third person. And what was fascinating to observe was that it was very hard for most of us to talk about ourselves in the third person because we tend to separate ourselves from territory and from community and then find that there are these stumbling blocks when we are not talking about ourselves. And so I, over the weekend, thought a lot about what it means to live with this kind of disconnect and the barriers that it puts up for us to think about the future because we are thinking of the self and the ego and not about community and not about territory and all of us, this big us or big we, as people have been talking about, as an ecosystem. I want to challenge everyone in this conversation and for any future conversations that we have together to think about ourselves as part of the ecosystem as a way to get to a place where we can plan for a deep future while also very strongly acknowledging the work that we have to do right now and the fact that we have agency to both do the work now and build a future that perhaps we won't even be around to see. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Jasmine to facilitate this fantastic conversation. Folks, remember that if you have questions or want to share, please go ahead and do so in the chat. Introduce yourselves in the chat so that we know who you are. And thanks again for joining.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hilda, my partner in crime in all things in the philanthropic sector. So, bienvenidas, bienvenides, bienvenidos, buenos días, buenas tardes, depending on where you are in the world joining us. I am Jasmine Chavez. I'm the VP of Movement Building and Infrastructure for Hispanics and Philanthropy. And I'm so excited for this conversation and so grateful for Hilda for really imagining what our Good Ancestor series was going to look like. You know, for a lot of us, we're living in a moment that is extremely difficult for our communities in terms of understanding for those of us in philanthropy, what is the immediate and what is the long term, right? And both of the part of the challenge of building and thinking into the long term is really looking at, can we really challenge ourselves, to Hilda's point, in terms of breaking down these ideas of cycles that kind of keep us in this state of perpetual loss of power or perceived loss of power, right? And really look at the ways in which we can start to look and start to build the infrastructure and the systems that will allow our communities to thrive, to be seen, to be powerful in all the ways in which we know we are. One of the things that I want to remind us as a futurist is to really kind of think of the six principles of how the Good Ancestor series was built. We are talking about deep time humility. What do we mean by that? It's recognizing the vastness of time and our relatively short existence. And it humbles us to really kind of think beyond our immediate concerns and build towards our 7 generations forward. Cathedral thinking, meaning that we are embracing projects with long-term visions and strategies, like the construction of the pyramids of Mexico, of Teotihuacan, Tenochtitlan of Egypt. We won't get to see the completion of these things, but we get at least to start to build the foundations as we start to build these monuments to our liberation, really, right? Intergenerational justice, considering the needs and the rights of future generations in our current decisions and policies and not being exclusive of that. Long-term foresight, developing tools and strategies that anticipate future challenges and opportunities. And then learning from the past, right? One of the things many of you know, I teach Chicanos in the law, and I start from a perspective of understanding the ways in which multiple communities have been impacted by the legal system and how it impacts Latinos and Chicanos today. And we can't get to that without having a deep understanding of where we've been and then starting to build towards where we're going. And then reimagining our institutions, including the philanthropic sector, right? How are we reforming all the political, the economic, the social systems to better serve our interests, both in the present and in the future? So just keep that in mind. I'll drop it in the chat in terms of how it is that we are building this kind of Good Ancestor series together and this Good Ancestor work collectively, which is why I'm so excited to have two super chingonas join us in this conversation. Melissa Morales of Somos Votantes, Becca Guerra of Guerra Strategies, and the ways in which they have spent a significant time responding both to the immediate and also starting to build in really innovative ways towards our future. So with that, I'm going to get us started. Melissa and Becca, if we can have you introduce yourselves, because I feel like I would not do you justice in terms of your badassness. So I will start with Melissa, and then I'll come over to you, Becca.
Hi, everyone. So happy to be here with all of you. My name is Melissa Morales. I'm the founder and president of Somos Votantes, which is a Latino engagement and community organization that I don't consider us national. I consider us multi-state. All of our program, our communities are built within states and built meant to build power within states. But my background is really grown out of the labor movement. I was with the Service Employees International Union for a long time. That's sort of where my power building, my base for power, and my prism for organizing really comes from. And I've brought that now into how are we using that to intentionally build power in Latino communities. So excited to have this conversation with you all today.
Hey y'all, I'm Becca Guerra Molo. I am the new co-author, along with my brilliant colleague, Kenya Morales, of a new report that's coming out called Frontlines of Democracy, Mapping Latino Civic Engagement Power in the United States. And this is really a landscape assessment of all 50 states, of the depth and breadth of our civic engagement as Latinos, what exists, where we are. Shocker, we are everywhere and we are organizing. And we're super excited. We'll drop the report in about 2 weeks, so expect it in your inbox. And it's really meant to be a blueprint for philanthropy of how to think about Latinos as you're doing your strategic decision making, your grant making within your portfolio. This is really a for us, by us project, and we are very excited to lift up the many, many voices and interviewees from around the country.
Thank you both so much. And I know I just want to flag one thing, Becca. I know that as you and I were checking in around this landscape report and all the work that y'all been doing, there's a significant amount of Latinas and Chicanas who are leading on the forefront in the fight for democracy, right? Whether it's Conchita Cruz from ASAP doing the birthright citizenship litigation, Melissa, the work that you're doing around civic engagement and increasing those numbers, right? We can go on and on. And at Change Unity, I actually shared a pretty significant list of Latina leaders who are really upholding multiple points of democracy and defense. So I just want to name that because I think it's important to know that, like, for me, Latinas are the future in the defense of this work. But I'm going to start with kind of really thinking of long-term power building, right? All of your work reminds us that democracy is not episodic, it's generational. When we think about the next 10 to 20 years, what infrastructure do Latina communities still need in order to build durable political power that isn't wiped out every election cycle?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Jasmine, because part of this is thinking about the long term. So right now we're in a cycle of thinking about the next 4 years, maybe the next 2 years. So we pop up organizations, and if they aren't super successful or don't make major change in about 2 to 4 years, we get rid of them or we divest or we move on to the next shiny thing. And I think as we think about long term for the next 10, 20 years, there's a couple things we need to think about. And part of that, one of them is organizational sustainability. We need to think about salaries and benefits for staff. We need to be thinking about how are we keeping good people on? How are we making sure that they are provided the resources to grow through professional development and trainings? And we need to make sure that the organizations themselves have what they need, especially in this moment. We are seeing an increase in need for mental health. I think the next thing to think about is really how we measure success differently. Much of how we measure the success of organizations is based around elections. And I think we need some new metrics that really highlight how they are reaching to communities, how are they getting intel from communities, how are they moving people that are beyond elections. And then I think the last thing, especially for this group to think about as we're thinking about infrastructure, is that we need more Latina voices in philanthropy, and not just as entry level or part of the team or an admin, but as decision makers and people that are moving money, folks that are rooted in community and rooted in states. So that's where I would start in terms of long-term infrastructure.
On our
Thank
end,
you.
if I can just hop in, I think like as with my, my Somos hat on, as we're thinking about, we really came into this year knowing that our community was facing a lot of different challenges. I think in all of the conversations that we were having last year, just to give you a sense of our scale, and there was a 6-week period last year where we had over 300,000 conversations across the country in Latino communities. And I say if we had 300,000, we had one, and it was that people were just wanting someone to listen about the struggle that they were facing, that everything felt very, very hard for them, for their family, and they were looking for answers about what that means for the future, especially as they think about their children, or what it means even for them in their life. And so we started thinking this year, what does that mean and how we should be thinking about what we're delivering for communities? Where are our investments going? What does that mean to build something? And so we started thinking about what do the next 5 to 10 years look like on two specific things. One is trust. Like it feels like the infrastructure that we have built is often responding to outside dynamics, outside people, sort of a them dynamic. How is our community doing something for someone else, as opposed to how are we delivering for our own community in a way that's building trust in the long term? So that was really key for us this year. We have tried to do that in a couple of ways. The first is through direct economic resources. So that has been thousands of backpacks filled with school supplies. That has been gas cards and grocery cards, and then building intentional spaces for people to plug into. So really trying to figure out, is there a way for us to meet people's direct economic needs with the investments that we have in a way that builds trust? So we're doing that on a direct level. And then we actually just announced, which is very exciting for us, doing that what are ways that like we should be delivering big things for our community as well, to build this trust. So we just announced what is $133 million of medical debt relief for our communities in Nevada. There's no application, there's no red tape, which often can be a barrier for our communities because we're asking them to share very sensitive information. That is not like there's no barrier here. The debt is already gone. We've erased the debt. They'll be getting notifications the week of Thanksgiving, but using all of that to introduce ourselves to our community as someone that they can trust, that's listening to their needs, and that's trying to build community amongst themselves. Because that's the second piece, I think, as we think about long-term infrastructure. One of the most alarming things for us last year that we learned in talking to our community was that when we asked, especially younger Latinos, to describe community, they had a hard time doing it, like defining what community meant to them. And for us, it is, if we have lost the thread on what community is, we've got a bigger problem because our entire value system is based on the fact that we should give a care about each other, that we should care what happens to the community. And so through our like the distribution of these resources, we're actually doing this through a lot of large scale in-person community events to bring people together and to build those bonds. So I think as we think about infrastructure for the long term, trust and community for us are really, really key.
I love that, Melissa, and I love that you shared about the medical debt program, the ways in which you, again, like when you think of ways in which we are providing an economic space of support, right, to bring people kind of into the work and to show really an intentionality of care as well, right? It isn't performative, but it's really rooted on being able to address a very specific need while also ensuring that they know the organization and the type of work that you will continue to support them with, right? And I know within the sector, we've talked a lot with funders around the need to support what is called like 2Gen organizations, where they're really meeting multiple areas of needs for our communities, whether it's food banks that are now after school programs. We've know organizations have had to merge together. And so we're asking funders like, don't look down upon organizations that are really kind of pulling those resources together, especially in this moment, because they're feeling multi-specific needs for our communities, right? So I really love that you really shared that. And the other thing you talked about trust. And I think a lot, Brene Brown says that trust is built in small acts, not in these grandeur, things and showcases and events, but really in the small ways in which we're showing up for our community and showing that level of care. So just really grateful. And then Becca, infrastructure. Infrastructure in terms of just being able to sustain these organizations in this moment is so critical. I want to talk a little bit because there's a few reports that are coming out this year, right? We know that there's an ECI's post-mortem report around the 2024 elections. Becca, you shared the landscape report that you're all doing. We know there's Project 2045 led by Rosa Maria Castañeda. So there's a lot of great data that's coming out for our funders to be able to really have a reason to develop a much stronger strategy around the ways in which they're supporting Latina nonprofits and infrastructures. So with all of these new reports, both momentum that are really kind of highlighting both momentum and systemic barriers, especially as we're seeing it for what we're understanding are young Latino voters, right? What data points do you think funders aren't paying enough attention to? And why do these overlooked insights matter for the investments that philanthropy needs to make right now? And Melissa, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I can definitely dig in. I saw someone just drop the ECI's report in the chat. Would definitely recommend that people read that. I've dug in on that. I think it's an incredible source of knowledge. But also I will, full disclaimer, I'm a bit biased. In ECI's first year, I was their first research director as we were getting ECI's off the ground. So excited to see them continue on that trajectory. But I do think one thing that I think if we look across the board, of what all of these reports are highlighting, there's a few major things that stand out. And first is that the power and the importance of our community is undeniable. Like it is highlighted in all of these reports. I think we are seeing a huge national narrative about it because of that reason. I would love to see more of the narrative driven by our own internal community, which is why I think conversations like this are important. I do think one of the biggest sort of trends that we are seeing is that Latinos across the board, and we're seeing this in our own internal research at Somos, is that are incredibly pragmatic. They are looking for solutions. They are looking for, um, to your point, Jasmine, I thought that was so beautifully put that it's not the grandeur of promises that they are looking for, but they are looking for what is the everyday solutions that people are providing that I can also deliver for my family, because the sort of like
Yeah.
delivering that for your family is a love language for Latinos. Like, how are we giving to our parents, to our children,
Yeah.
to our community, those around us? Like, that is very real. And we see that consistently in every set of research that we've seen and in all of the postmortems that I've seen from the last election. I think in the latest survey that Somos just came out with, and we just released the top lines of that today. Happy to circulate those to everybody. But 95% of Latinos that we polled, 95%, I don't know that I've ever seen this kind of consensus, said that they were very concerned about rising prices and their ability to meet the needs of their families. Like that's such a huge consensus that it feels like we can't ignore that as we're thinking again about how we're delivering for our community, not using them as the means for an end, but actually delivering for them in a real way. And so that is the data point that I like. If I can drive that home, that is so real for people. We're going to continue to see that be the case and want that to be how, like, that should be the cornerstone of how we're building our programs and where we're investing. It's like, how are we meeting those needs in real time in a real way?
Becca, I'll come to you.
Yeah, one of the goals of this project was really to listen to our community. We interviewed just short of 200 state and national leaders, and we really wanted to hear where folks were at and what they were saying. Part of the report talks about our political our framework, which is around the political efficacy cycle, which says that there's three parts, and that the action of voting does not happen in a vacuum. And so often we focus on just one part of the cycle, which says, how do people turn out and are they voting for a specific party? And rather, we say there's actually two other pieces that we have to think about. We have to think about how the elites are signaling to our community and thinking about stakeholders, thinking about leadership, thinking about philanthropy in particular. How is money moving? If money isn't moving to Latinos, then you're making the case that they're not important, both in the States, but also to us as Latina leaders that are leading this work. It is really hard to hear, well, your community isn't important, so you're not getting the grant, or you can't move money in that portfolio that way. And then the third part of that cycle is really around the community feeling empowered and really being able to then turn out and make that action. And often that signaling that says you're not important disempowers communities. It makes them feel like, well, if my vote doesn't matter. So the report itself is within that framework. And what I think we have to listen to, and we listen to throughout these interviews, is what people are saying. And so, Melissa, spot on, as always. It's about the economics. We heard time and time again that it was about cost of living, it was about housing access, it was about food access. And many of the organizations are stepping up to do that. But it's a broader conversation about how do we make housing, food affordable for our people. I think the other thing that people said to us as we think about this is that the policy is not meeting the needs. And this was regardless of party. So this is not a partisan thing, but across both, they said, politicians are not meeting our needs. We don't have a single piece of policy that we can directly say benefits our community. That's a problem. And then I think the other part is really, electeds don't care about us. We heard it on both sides of the aisle. They could point to person after person where they said, they don't care about us. And so why should I go vote? You tell me to come out and vote every October, November, and yet I see no material changes in our election. In our daily lives. I think the last thing is really just around the fact that many of our folks aren't even at the table. As we think about these policy decisions, many of the folks working on them aren't even there. So I think we need to think beyond turnout, and I think we need to think about some of the broader pieces that push folks and mobilize them into voting and why, and some of those other elements that folks like philanthropy as elite signalers can help influence.
Thank you both so much. I think you also named something, Becca and Melissa, that I think there's like a very outdated narrative that needs to be retired, that like Latinos only care about immigration, right? I know, and Hilda and my directors of our programs and our teams, we are very much like, no, we are a multi-issue impacted community. Like every issue impacts Latinos, right? You could talk about climate, you could talk about economic decisions, food deserts, right? You name it, and I promise you it impacts Latino communities, right? And we also talk about the ways in which, you know, Latinx communities, as we speak to this work and as we kind of look at these different election cycles, the many shortfalls of both the Democratic and both the Republican parties or whatever the in between is in terms of who they think we are, despite all the data, it always falls back almost to this trope and these narratives, right, of Latinos only care about immigration. So I really appreciate you kind of really naming that it's really much more complicated beyond that. But at the same time, it's not. It's the same thing that's impacted all families in this moment, all communities, right? So just really grateful for you all, for you both to name that. Much of your work is really sitting at the intersection around organizing policy and narrative, right? And whether it's in the now, but or also in the work that you have both built out in the past. From your point of view, what are the most harmful short-term funding habits that philanthropy needs to retire? And what does being a good ancestor look like in practice, but for funders, especially for funders who want to understand how they resource this type of work more responsibly? And Becca, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could point to many of the things we've heard, the lack of long-term funding, the lack of, general operating funds, late money coming in. I think all of that is true. But I think in the context of this moment, there's a couple things. I don't think philanthropy can afford to ignore what is happening to
Mm.
Latino communities around the country at this moment. I think that we need to be real about rapid response and funding that work that is happening. I think it is very hypocritical to be asking questions about how people are going to turn out in 2026 and are people going to mobilize. People aren't sure if they're going to make it to the end of this year. We have people that are not leaving their homes, members of our community, for fear of being kidnapped and disappeared. Like that is real in our community. So I think there has to be a real effort from philanthropy. And unfortunately, I think it will be Latinas who will have to push it to say, you cannot afford to ignore this moment. I think the other thing to think about is just what exists and what to make sustainable. Post 2020, when we saw, excuse me, post 2016, when we saw the first Donald Trump election, there was a lot of money that went into fighting everything that might be coming, especially when we saw kids in cages. And so organizations were started up around the country to do that. And this time around, there's not the same enthusiasm. There's like, well, philanthropy's under attack and we're all worried. And we're hearing from groups on the ground that are saying, I'm being doxxed, I'm being followed. They are destroying our buildings, ice circles around our parking lot to intimidate people. We've heard
Yep.
from interviewees who said we had to remove our name from and our address from Google Maps so that we wouldn't be targeted anymore. It's real what's happening right now. And I think the other thing is to really talk to your grantees, see what they're going through, because as there's this moment right now of philanthropy on hold, grantees are losing grants left and right, and not by anything bad they did. They're saying, this funder's decided to change course. They're kind of in a wait and see. We had groups that had a budget of 300,000 that said, I lost a $150,000 grant and with like 3 weeks notice. How are they going to make that up? They can't. So I think it's really
Yep.
on philanthropy to think about this moment and then the long-term impacts of that.
Yeah, and
Thank you.
I would say I think like all of that is so spot on. And as someone who runs an organization can speak to the sort of dearth mindset that has existed this year in a year where it feels like our community is under attack and we're trying to figure out how we're supporting rapid response efforts. That has led to part of what we're trying to address through our programs, which is that people feel incredibly isolated.
Mhm.
That they feel cut off from community, that they feel cut off from sort of any sort of broader picture. And so we're trying to figure out, like, we have to be investing in pulling people back in and letting them know that they're not alone. And that I think part of the sort of like short-term narrative that with funding that we often get tied into is that like if it's not tied into a direct electoral outcome, then it's not worth investing in. And we know that that's certainly not true, especially when we're thinking about the sort of trust building, the sort of a community building that needs to happen this year. So I think that would be a big one that I would lift up. The second thing that I would say is just with the sort of funding crunch that a lot of, especially Latino organizations have been experiencing, is that it means we're losing a lot of good Latino talent that have been in the pipeline that are now going other places where they have to find jobs in other places because the funding is not there. And that is, I think, it's sort of taken a backseat to all of these very important narratives that out there, but that keeps me up at night. Like we cannot afford to lose any Latino talent. In fact, we should have been doubling down on that investment in that leadership this year. So as funders are thinking about, where they need to invest and the why, that is a huge reason, a huge flag for me.
Yeah, thank you for raising that, Melissa. I think about that quite a bit as well as we're having people move outside even of the movement organizing world, and they're going into spaces that have nothing to do with community in this way. And I know, and I've heard from many folks as I speak with nonprofits, the grief that they're holding around having to close doors and do something so incredibly difficult. I know this month many of us heard about Poder, North Carolina closing. That's a huge hit for the South. It's a huge hit for North Carolina. Um, and I don't know where that leader is it's another Latina leader. She's incredible at what she does, right? I don't know where she's going and I want to know where she's going so we can keep her in the work, right? And so you're naming, I think, all of the things that we're holding around the difficulty to be Latino in this moment in America is so incredibly complicated. And I know folks have said, well, we've been through worse. It doesn't mean we have to do it again, right? It doesn't mean that we can't learn from those lessons from the past and figure out our different ways, right? And part of the charge to the Unity folks a couple of weeks ago was like, what are you waiting for? Like, are you waiting for us to ask you to build monuments to detention camps in the Southwest? Right? What do you want us to like ask for money for in 10 years where you're literally building brick by brick our monuments to the horrors that we're seeing today, right? And so I'm really grateful in terms of just being so honest to our funders and saying, hey, we need you to be good ancestors in this work so you can look back and be proud of the ways in which you've built this foundation with us, right? So just really grateful for what you're sharing. And I think for all of us to also hold the reality of the waters in which we're swimming with, to be Latino in America, to be an immigrant in America, to be undocumented in America in this moment. I think holding all of that, right? Knowing both of you, despite the uncertainty, and I say this a lot, sometimes people have to tell us, like, you should be comfortable in the uncertainty. Embrace the paradox of both truths being real, right? It is a very difficult moment, and yet we're doing really powerful work. And the thing that I tell folks that's hard about that is when we grow up in working class communities, immigrant and documented communities, uncertainty is actually a muscle we don't get to practice. Because uncertainty for our families means that there's an eviction notice on the door, we have no food that day. And so, as professionals, to engage in uncertainty and reimagining work is actually a muscle that takes us a it's harder to build, right? But with you all, despite the uncertainty, each of you continue to lead with courage, with discipline and joy. What practices or principles help you stay anchored in this work and sit in the uncertainty, right? And what guidance do you offer funders who want to lead with that same clarity through this volatility? And Melissa, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think if I can just have a small point of privilege, I'll share a story that I has really inspired me as I think about the kind of leader I personally want to be, the kind of leadership I think my team and our community needs in this time. My dad told me a story once about when he was young. He grew up in Texas. He was one of 14 children. God bless my grandmother, two sets of twins. My dad has twin brothers and twin sisters. So big family. And Texas at that time, in the 60s and then the early 70s was a hard time to be Latino. And so there was a rule where you could not speak Spanish at school. You were not allowed to speak Spanish at school. And my dad was young. I think he said he was probably in like second grade at the time. But he loved his language. Like he could speak English, but he loved Spanish. It was the language they spoke at home. It was the language of his brothers and sisters who he loved so much, um, and his parents. And so he was very stubborn. I like to think that's where I get it from. And he continued to speak Spanish at school. And so they would um, they would swat you the first time they caught you doing it when you got in trouble. Then they would send you home and then they would suspend you. So he got sent home at this point for speaking Spanish at school. And my grandmother, who has 14 children and is trying to run a household and put food on the table and do all the things, was like, I don't have time to deal with you. You go wait outside until your dad gets home. And so my dad thought that he knew what that meant. When his dad got home, he was going to get it. And so my grandpa gets home and my grandmother tells him what happens, and my grandpa walks outside. And my dad said instead of getting swatted again, like he expected, that my grandfather took his hand and he walked him to a local store and he bought him a new set of clothes. Like my dad said he remembers it was a shirt and shorts and shoes. And my dad is the second to youngest of 14 kids, so there were no new clothes. Everything was hand me downs, even if it was from his sister. And my grandfather told him, I want you to think about how proud you feel right now in this new set of clothes. That's the life I want for you. But you can't have that in this country unless you speak English. So I need you to go to school and I need you to learn and I need you to learn to speak English. And I think about that story a lot because it shows the value that our community puts on both providing for our families, but also setting our children up for success, even if sometimes it means cutting off a piece of who we are and what we love. And I think it also shows a type of leadership that leads from a place of love. I think right now there's a lot of tendency to lead with um, hate, not hate, but uh, you got what you asked for, or fear that we need to cower because things are against us, right? Like there's a lot of negative feelings that we could lead from right now. But I think leading from a place of strength and the type of love that my grandfather exhibited that day, and like illustrating that to our teams is so important right now. And I hope that's the type of leadership that I'm promoting every day with my team.
Mm, thank you, Melissa. That's such a powerful story.
You know, when we started this project, we were trying to answer a question, or rather, we were trying to prevent questions. We knew that in 2024, a lot of pundits, particularly white pundits, had this question about Latinos as a problem to be solved, something to be fixed. How are we going to deal with Latinos? And Kenya and Jasmine were two of the architects that said, wait a minute, how well do we know ourselves? And very quickly, Kenya and I decided that this was going to be a love letter to our community. This was our way of putting our, stamp and mark in history and saying, this is where our community is. And here's the incredible work we're doing. And we are in all 50 states. And look at these incredible leaders. When they have donor panels, we hear from the same 3 to 5 Latinos, Latinas as they are the only voice. And there are people in Kentucky, there are people in Utah, Nebraska, Kansas, Ohio that we have never heard from who are brilliant. And so that was part of what we were trying to do, was lift up those voices. And for us, it was like, Kenya and I have a little bit of privilege in the work that we've done, that we've made relationships within the philanthropic sector. And we said, what can we do to put this before more eyes to really make the case for our community? And it wasn't easy. When we first started, we had a lot of people tell us, well, that's good, but we're not going to support that effort because, there's some other important things happening. Or, yeah, that's a good idea, but like Latinos, really, are they going to vote for us or not? And it was these really transactional, really short-sighted ways of thinking. And Kenya and I were determined, we were like, even if this does not move millions of dollars, if we could change how philanthropy thinks about Latinos, not as a problem to be solved, not as something to deal with, but as a powerful force full of opportunity, full of brilliance that really just needs to be invested in and scaled, that would be the win. That would be why we did all this work, why we spent hundreds of hours doing this, because it is worth it for our people to be featured and centered and thought about and invested in. And that was really just what we wanted to do. And so I think for me, and I would say for Kenya, it's really about the why and why we do our work. And for us, it was all about our people. It was every story we heard through our interviews. It was every conversation where people said, I mean, Melissa, people had so many stories like you. I do this because of something that happened to my dad, or my grandma told me this, or my community here is facing this. And it was like, that's what we got to get in front of philanthropy. And I'm not just the leaders that are on this call, but thinking broadly about white philanthropy. They need to see us as a force to be reckoned with, not just an add-on, not just something that is a maybe a nice to have. No, we are the base. We are the people that you need to be talking to, and you need to invest in our work.
Well said. Well said. I mean, I think, Melissa, as you were sharing your story, like a lot of people don't know, but like just like how we had Native American boarding schools, we had Mexican Americanization schools all along the Southwest, right? Which was made to remove the language, remove the culture, and clean up Mexican Americans from the 1920s. All the way until 1974. The last linguistic Americanization school closed in 1974, right? And so there's so many components, and we're seeing videos now today of teachers telling our young people don't speak Spanish, right? Like that's a whole different webinar by itself, right? In terms of the linguistic oppression, the cultural oppression that we're starting to see in other institutions, right? But I'm so grateful the ways in which you both really lead from a space of deep, deep love for our community and a deep understanding that, Becca, to your point, funders might not see us as a priority in this moment, but we're going to do the work anyway. And I promise you, you're going to see that as we move through these next 5 and 10 years in terms of who we are, how we build power, and the impact that we will have. Because we're already witnessing it, right? And so, sometimes it's a matter of telling folks like you're kind of either with us or you're going to catch up to us at a later point, but we'd love to have you now as opposed to later, right? So with that, I know we're coming up on time, and these good ancestor series, we never have enough time, and we get that feedback from all our participants. But I do want to end in terms of like a strong call to action to funders and to donors in this moment, right? What is the one thing you want them to walk away from? And I also want to acknowledge Karina Barillas. We see you from Louisville, Kentucky. La Casita, welcome. We know you're holding down the South and doing incredible work. just to all of you who have kind of been participating, we see you, we so appreciate you. Please know that we are looking and protecting the Latino nonprofit ecosystem in the ways in which philanthropy needs to be held accountable to fund the work and to get funding out, and also to build this other side. But for you all, what is the thing you want funders and donors to walk away with from this conversation? Melissa, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll jump off here, which is that I think I would love if we can really push the idea that we shouldn't be thinking about the investments that we're making into Latino communities as year cycles, right? We really need to be thinking in 5 to 10 year cycles of what is the long game, what does the growth look like, and how are we fully funding that and investing in that plan over the course of that decade, and really starting to think more long term.
Thank you. Becca.
I would tell funders you can't afford to ignore this moment. This is a point of no return for philanthropy in terms of Latino infrastructure, organizing communities. We need to respond. We need to be resourcing rapid response work. We need to be resourcing infrastructure capacity. If you want to talk about 10 years from now, if you want to talk about 26, 28, the census in 30, any of the stuff you want to talk about, it starts right now. And our communities are hurting and we need resources. We talked to quite a few groups throughout this report who said, to be honest, rapid response isn't being funded. It just isn't. We're just doing it with overtime. We're doing it with volunteers. We're doing it any way we can because our community needs it. And I think that if philanthropy decides to ignore this moment, it will go down in history as the moment that Latino infrastructure dissolved.
Oof. Oof. That is a heavy, heavy burden, philanthropy. I hope you heard it loud and clear, from Becca all the way in the back. Um, Thank you both so much. And thank you to all the folks who showed up via Maria. I see you in terms of the work that you're doing with unhoused women. I'm so grateful for both of you because I think, one of the best parts of my job is that I get to sit with Latino leaders across the country and just listen, right? I get to listen to the good, I get to listen to the sad, I get to listen to the complicated. And then my role is to take that back into my organization, take that back into the sector and say, hey, you need to listen to us. This is what I'm hearing. This is what I'm seeing. We have strategies. We have people moving. We have things that people can invest in, right? It's not enough to say, well, we're trying to figure out our strategy. We don't have time for that. Right. And I think one of my things with philanthropy is understanding that risk for you is very different than risk for our communities, risk for our nonprofits, right? Especially our larger institutions. We know that you have the general counsels to be able to sustain a risk, and you have smart enough people within your institution to rename something and still fund incredible work, right? If you want to go large, you can fund due process and the protection of constitutional rights in America because those impact the whole, even though it's being targeted against Latino and immigrant communities at this time. And it's those leaders who are leading that fight, right? So be creative, understand, and obviously do your risk assessment, but don't equate the risk to our nonprofit and Latino leaders in this moment as the same risk to you, because you can take on a very different risk that our Latino leaders cannot, right? And we cannot afford to lose more and more days where our communities are being terrorized, right? I also want to shout out Chicago. I see David Piscata on, and Chicago, and the ways in which philanthropy has been moving with our nonprofits, with the city, in terms of being able to create a much more collective response from what we learned in LA, right? And so I encourage us to kind of take those opportunities and those lessons to kind of grow and continue to build this larger work in terms of how we are truly resourcing our community in the now and being creative about how do we build this on the other side. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much, Melissa and Becca, for joining us. Thank you, Hilda, for envisioning our Good Ancestor series. We will be back in 2026 with additional conversations. Thank you to our interpreters who joined us today and who are holding it down for us as well. And always to Inaru, who really leads our webinar and our tech work. To all of you, we see you, we appreciate you. We send all our love to you in the ways in which you are holding and doing this work. And remember that if we weren't powerful, we wouldn't be targeted in the ways that we are in this moment. And so they are afraid of the power that we bring. And let's not capitulate to that fear. Don't absorb it, observe it, and let's keep moving and building together. So with that, thank you all so much. I wish you a wonderful week and a wonderful holiday break. And we will be back in 2026. Thank you so much.
Thank you.